It was 1840. Booker Webster felt a heavy silence settle over the Comanche camp. A few seasons ago, he had been captured by the tribe, and since then he had learned their language and gained a new family. But that day, everything changed. The Texas forces had attacked a council meant to promote peace, taking the lives of leaders and other members of the community. Grief took many forms. Warriors cut their hair, something sacred to them, while the women wept and wounded their own skin. It didn't take long for mourning to turn into revolt. Booker watched as fires were lit and stakes were raised, noticing that white prisoners were being gathered to face the tribe's furious response. Fear gripped him, but his safety was ensured by his Comanche adoptive mother. That moment would stay with Booker forever, as he witnessed both the deep wound inflicted on the heart of this people and their unshakable determination to protect what remained. Imagine living in a land where battles are constant, and the threat of falling into enemy hands hangs in the air. For many prisoners, the end came quickly, but most, especially women and children, endured long sessions of torture. What shocked many outsiders was discovering that these brutal practices weren't carried out by the warriors, but by Comanche women themselves, whose toughness often matched or even surpassed that of the most feared men in the tribe. In daily life, they handled almost every task except for hunting, warfare, and weapon making. They crafted clothing, blankets, tools, and shelters with impressive speed. A Comanche woman could set up a teepee in minutes and take it down even faster, packing everything onto horses when it was time to move. Despite their demanding routines, they didn't hesitate when it came to revenge. As soon as the warriors returned from their raids, captured men and women faced cruel punishments at the hands of these women. This sharp contrast between their role in maintaining the well-being of the tribe and their ruthless treatment of enemies reveals the complex nature of Comanche women's power on the plains. It was in this balance between creation and destruction that their deep influence over their world became clear. Across the vast lands of the Great Plains, the Comanche lived a life shaped by constant movement. While the men went out hunting, it was up to the women to make use of every part of the animals they brought back. They tanned hides, dried meat, and as buffalo hides became more valuable in the 19th century, saw their workload increase. Successful warriors accumulated wealth and often had more than one wife, since each new marriage meant more processed hides to trade. In everyday life, practicality was key for Comanche women. Unlike the men who took pride in their long hair, they kept theirs short to make daily tasks easier and to avoid parasites, as baths were usually reserved for specific rituals. When it came to body paint, men used black, a color tied to war and death, while women preferred bright shades like red and yellow. European visitors of the time noted that the Comanche were, on average, shorter than other tribes, but their nomadic lifestyle and ability to make use of every resource spoke to the strength of their culture. The relentless work of the women, combined with choices that prioritized efficiency, kept their community thriving and played a major role in their success. Imagine a landscape stretching beyond the horizon. In every corner of this vast territory, one thing was certain: living on the plains demanded constant courage, and it was in this environment that the Comanche people thrived. It didn't matter that their women stood just over 5 feet tall, or that their men rarely grew much taller than 5'4". What really stood out was their incredible skill on horseback and with a bow and arrow. Riding wasn't just a way to get around. It was part of every Comanche's identity. From a young age, boys and girls learned to ride with incredible skill, forming an almost mystical bond with their horses. At the same time, the bow and arrow became an essential tool for hunting, defense, and survival. Some said that if you saw a Comanche approaching on horseback, it was already too late to react. While the men led war parties, the women were just as prepared for battle. Not only could they shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, but they were ready to defend their families if necessary. When European groups or U.S. government forces attacked their camps, there was no division of labor. Everyone rose to fight, driven by a deep sense of duty. When warriors returned from their raids, they brought back prisoners from various groups. But in the camp, it wasn't up to them to decide the captive's fate. That responsibility mostly fell to the women, who carried out severe punishments and revealed the most ruthless side of the tribe. Not all prisoners, however, were killed. Some, like Booker Webster, were even adopted, especially women and children. But this adoption didn't guarantee protection. Boys usually faced less hostility, while girls dealt with a different kind of threat. To Comanche women, older girls were seen as competition within the group's hierarchy, making their daily lives a struggle filled with intimidation and mistreatment. Rachel Plummer and Matilda Lockhart are two well-known examples. Matilda was only 14 when she was captured, but in the eyes of the Comanche, she was already considered an adult, which meant she was forced into slavery. 2 years later, in 1840, the Penateca Comanche were called to San Antonio to negotiate with Texas authorities. One of the key terms of the agreement demanded the return of all white prisoners, including Matilda. When she was presented to officials, she had deep wounds and burns reaching from her face down to her heels, marks meant to keep her submissive and prevent any escape attempts. That meeting became public proof of the brutal treatment many captives endured. In 1836, during the attack on Fort Parker in Texas, Rachel Plummer was ripped from her everyday life and thrown into the harsh reality of Comanche captivity. From day one, she endured not only the violence of the warriors, but also the scorn of some of the tribe's women. In her accounts, she described how she never had a moment without pain, even witnessing her own skin being repeatedly wounded. Shortly after giving birth, she suffered an unimaginable loss. Her baby was killed because the Comanches claimed the child was a burden that interfered with Rachel's assigned tasks. Overwhelmed by grief, she sank into a period where she no longer saw a way to survive. Then came a day that changed everything. A Comanche woman insulted her and ordered her to fetch a tool for digging up roots. As Rachel walked away to complete the task, exhausted from the endless abuse, she made a decision. She would provoke her captors until they ended her life. She started by refusing to obey. The reaction was immediate. The Comanche woman lunged at her, yelling and shoving her to the ground. They rolled through the dirt, biting and scratching, while the men around them shouted words Rachel didn't fully understand. In the chaos, her eyes locked onto a buffalo bone, and without thinking, she grabbed it. Channeling all her built-up rage, she struck her opponent in the head. To Rachel's surprise, no one rushed to stop them. In fact, the shouting around them sounded more like encouragement than disapproval. She kept fighting, determined to make herself heard, until she managed to overpower the other woman. As she pinned her down, she realized her opponent, now gasping for breath, was pleading for mercy. At that moment, Rachel understood something had shifted. Instead of accepting the fate she feared, she had taken control of her own story, even if just for a moment. What happened after that fight is still debated. But that moment was a turning point in Rachel Plummer's life. From then on, her will to resist became stronger than the fear that had followed her until that day. The camp fell into an eerie silence. Gasping for breath, Rachel realized that her provocation hadn't led to the death she had expected. Instead, she had proven that she wouldn't go down without a fight. In that moment, she understood that maybe, just maybe, she could push past her own limits. Still clutching the blood-stained buffalo bone, she stared at the Comanche woman lying on the ground. For a brief moment, she was shocked to still be alive. No man stepped forward to restrain or attack her. They simply backed away, as if the fight didn't matter. But the tension in the air was undeniable. Moments later, an older woman from the tribe stepped forward to confront Rachel. Feeling disrespected by the brawl, she ordered Rachel to gather straw to start a fire, one where she would be burned alive. Rachel stood her ground and refused to obey. Furious, the elder took matters into her own hands, lighting the flames and setting off a brutal struggle. As the fire grew, the two women fought, both suffering burns as they stumbled into the flames. The men stood around them watching, entertained by the chaos. At one point, one of the poles supporting a tipi collapsed, nearly crushing Rachel. But even with her injuries, she managed to win once again. The next day, she was summoned to appear before the Council of Men. What would happen there was a mystery. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of the real test that awaited her. Rachel thought she was in for a harsh punishment, but the tribal elders simply ordered her to fix the tipi pole that had broken during the fight. To complete the task, she demanded the presence of the older woman, though she didn't fully understand the dynamics between Comanche women. Meanwhile, the men kept their distance, acting as if conflicts like these were just a normal part of daily life. After her first fight, Rachel washed the face of the opponent she had defeated. That simple gesture immediately changed the woman's attitude. She began to respect Rachel more. Apparently, this custom helped establish positions within the group, while also strengthening bonds. Have you ever had a moment where a fight or disagreement actually brought you closer to someone? For Rachel, though, things were more complicated. She wasn't there by choice. She was held as a slave, forced to work, and used as a bargaining chip in potential deals. That made her valuable to the tribe. Some other prisoners were treated the same way, but many were seen as disposable and suffered even worse abuse at the hands of the village women. In 1840, Texas soldiers and Penateca Comanche chiefs met in hopes of reaching an agreement. Instead, the meeting became a turning point. The Texans demanded the immediate return of all white captives, but when that demand wasn't met, they decided to arrest the Comanche leaders present. Tensions exploded instantly. Dozens of Comanche were killed in what would later be remembered as the Council House fight. For those who survived, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was an unforgivable insult. As word spread among the Comanche people, warriors cut off parts of their hair, a powerful gesture of deep mourning. The women took part in an even more intense ritual. They screamed and cut their arms, legs, and even their breasts, following mourning traditions that went beyond physical pain. A young captive named Booker Webster witnessed it all up close. According to his account, some women even mutilated their own fingers. Others wounded themselves so severely that they didn't survive. After this extreme display of grief, the women turned their focus to the captives the Texans had been so eager to reclaim. That's when the retaliation began to take shape, an outcome that was soon inevitable for everyone involved. When Comanche men rode off to fight the Texans, they left behind an even more terrifying scene in the camps. While the warriors prepared for battle, the women took control of the white prisoners. That was when the violence turned into torture. Deep cuts, skin being torn away, and finally, fire consuming the victims while they were still alive. Sometimes it ended within a few hours. Other times, the suffering stretched on for days. For the Comanche, this wasn't an exception. It was a belief. They thought that mutilating an enemy affected not just their body in life, but also in death. In their language, Numunuu simply meant the people, and anyone outside of that definition was subject to a brutal fate if captured. While Comanche warriors were feared for their lightning-fast attacks and retreats, their women were known for their patience when dealing with captives. Torture was carried out with precision, and keeping trophies from enemies was part of a long-standing tradition that fueled the pride of their fighters. This ritual, passed down through generations, spread fear among settlers on the frontier. Everyone knew that if they were captured alive by the Comanche, there would be no mercy, no way out. That fear created a constant sense of tension. Few could imagine anything worse than being taken to a Comanche camp and facing what happened there. For many, this was the single most terrifying threat looming over the expanding territories.